Okay, so ready to dive into something I feel like we can all relate to,
Mm,
anxiety.
for sure.
Um, we're going to be looking at Sarah Knight's Calm the Feck Down.
Okay.
Have you had a chance to glance at this one?
I have, yeah.
All right, so you've looked at some of the excerpts that we're looking at for today,
Yes.
and what do you think of Knight's very direct, some might even say blunt approach?
Yeah, she definitely doesn't sugarcoat anything. I think that's part of what makes it so refreshing and relatable, you know? It's like she's not afraid to just come out and say what we're all thinking, but maybe too afraid to say out loud.
Right. It's sort of like having that friend who will tell you like it is. There's no BS. She's going to give it to you straight.
Exactly. And when it comes to anxiety, sometimes that's exactly what you need. A little dose of tough love, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I really liked how she tackles is how we can get caught in this what if spiral.
Oh, yeah.
And it's almost like you go down this rabbit hole and it just keeps getting worse and worse in your head.
Mm.
Have you experienced those?
Oh, all the time. I think we all do to some extent. It's like our brains are hardwired to focus on the negative, you know, to imagine all the worst case scenarios.
Right. And it's like it just keeps snowballing. You
Yeah.
start with this one little worry and then suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, my life is over.
Exactly. She calls that unraveling, and it's a really powerful metaphor because it's like picking at a loose thread on a sweater.
Oh, yeah.
It might seem small at first, but if you keep pulling on it, the whole thing can unravel. And that's kind of what happens with worry, you know? You start with one little thing, and then pretty soon it's like your whole life is falling apart.
And I love that analogy because it's so true. And I think we've all had that sweater
Yeah.
where you pull on one little thread and the next thing you know, it's like, well, I guess I'm not wearing this out in public again.
Exactly.
So she calls her approach the NoWorries Method, which I kind of love.
It's very straightforward.
It is very straightforward. And this is a two-step process, so anyone listening can feel like they can do this.
Absolutely.
The first part is to calm the heck down. What does she mean by that?
Well, it's not necessarily about suppressing your emotions entirely. It's really more about just getting a handle on them, right? Like, we're not aiming for this kind of like Zen-like state of no worries ever.
Right.
It's more about like, okay, how do we hit the pause button on this kind of like, you know, runaway train of anxiety and just sort of step back and assess the situation?
Okay, so it's not about becoming some emotionless robot, because let's be real, that's not going to happen.
Right. Exactly. And I don't think that's even healthy.
Yeah.
Like, we need to acknowledge our emotions, right? Like, they're there for a reason, but it's about not letting them control us, you know?
Totally. It's about getting a grip.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? How do we calm the heck down?
Well, one of the first things that Knight emphasizes is that, you know, not all worries are created equal. And I think that's really important to remember because we tend to, like, you know, lump them all together. It's sort of like worrying about whether you left the oven on is the same as worrying about, you know, some major life decision.
Exactly.
And so she introduces this idea of what she calls the shitstorm scale,
Okay.
which I find super helpful. And basically, this is a way of ranking your worries, but not by how scary they seem, because everything can seem scary when you're anxious, but by how likely they are to actually happen.
Okay, so it's like sorting those monsters under the bed from the actual, like,
Yeah.
real threats to our well-being.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So she ranks them on a scale of 1 to 5. So like a category 1 worry would be something that's highly unlikely to happen,
Got it.
whereas a category 5 is like, this is definitely going to happen.
Okay, so give me some examples.
Okay, so like a category 1 worry might be something like, I don't know, like getting struck by lightning.
Cup.
It's possible, but statistically it's very, very unlikely, right?
Right.
A category 5 worry would be something like, you know, death. It's going to happen to all of us eventually.
Right. So it's about looking at those what ifs and saying, okay, but is this actually likely, or am I just letting my anxiety run wild?
Exactly. So she talks about like your car breaking down. Like if you have a brand new car, the chances of it breaking down are pretty slim, right?
Right.
So that would be a category 1 worry. But if you're driving a, you know, 20-year-old car that's on its last legs and making all kinds of funny noises, well, then, yeah, the chances of it breaking down are much higher,
Yeah,
right?
there's probably a 4 or 5 at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's all about putting things into perspective.
It's like checking the anxiety weather report
Yeah.
before we decide whether we need to pack a raincoat or, like, build a bunker.
I love that analogy.
Right. It's all about preparation,
Yes.
right? And so she talks about becoming like, what does she say, like a probometer expert,
Mm-hmm.
which I kind of love. It's like we're evaluating the likelihood of our worries actually happening
Right.
because so much of anxiety is rooted in the unknown. and in these things that we create in our minds that are often so much worse than what reality actually is.
Exactly.
So it's about getting real with ourselves,
Yes.
getting real about our anxieties, and then not letting them control us. So we've talked about calming the heck down. We've talked about using that shitstorm scale
Yeah.
to really prioritize what we worry about. But what if we have assessed the situation
Yeah.
and the worry is valid? What do we do then?
Right.
Because we can't just wish it away, right?
No, absolutely not. And Knight totally gets that. She understands that sometimes you can't just like let it go, like we're not Disney characters.
Right.
So that's where step 2 of the no worries method comes in. And that is to deal with it,
Okay.
which sounds kind of obvious, right?
Right.
But I think what she's getting at is that it's not just about reacting, right? Like it's not just about like, oh, I'm worried, so I'm just going to like, freak out and do a million things. It's about doing it in a way that's actually productive.
Okay.
And so she advocates for what he calls productive, helpful, effective worrying, or PHEW.
TCLB. See, I love that. Sometimes we just need a good acronym to get us through. But what does that even look like? Productive worrying. It seems like an oxymoron.
It does, doesn't it? But it's basically channeling your anxiety into constructive action.
Okay.
So for example, let's say you're worried about your, I don't know, your finances. Like that's a really common one, right?
Yeah.
So instead of just like, lying awake at night stressing about it, what would be a PHEW approach?
Yeah.
It might be like, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to create a budget, or, I'm going to reach out to a financial advisor. Like, I'm going to take some concrete steps to address the situation.
Okay, so you're taking action, which in and of itself can sometimes alleviate that anxiety because you're like, okay, well, at least I'm doing something.
Exactly. It's that feeling of empowerment. So it's really about identifying what you can control in a situation and focusing your energy on that rather than all the things that you can't.
I like that. So PHEW is about recognizing that there are things you can't control, but you can control maybe how you react to it or what steps you take moving forward.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a really powerful shift in perspective.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are times when, even with the best intentions, even the most level-headed person is just like, I need to scream into a pillow,
Oh, absolutely. And Knight gets that. She's not saying that we should be, robots.
Right.
We're all human, and sometimes you just need to, have a little meltdown.
Cool.
But I think she also emphasizes that it's important to be aware of how those meltdowns are affecting us. Like, are they actually helpful in any way? Or are they just draining our energy and preventing us from actually dealing with the situation?
Right, so how do we find that balance? Because it's like, yeah, sometimes you need to let it out. But then how do we move from the freak out into the deal with it in a healthy way?
Yeah, well, she actually identifies 4 common ways that people kind of like freak out, and she calls them the 4 faces of freaking out, which I love.
The 4 faces of freaking out. Okay, I am intrigued. Tell me more.
All right, so the first one is the housefly.
Okay.
And this is the person who, like, they just kind of flit from worry to worry. They're like, they can't settle on any one thing. It's like, oh, I'm worried about this. And then, oh, I'm worried about that. And they just kind of like buzz around, but they never actually land on anything or do anything about it.
Okay, so they're kind of all over the place with their anxiety.
Exactly. Very scattered.
Okay, what's the next one?
The next one is the Eeyore.
Okay. I can see where this is going.
Named after the donkey from Winnie the Pooh.
Of course, yeah.
And this is the person who's just like, constantly pessimistic. They're always looking for, the worst case scenario. They're like, oh, it's never going to work out. What's the point?
Right. That negative self-talk can be so draining, though.
It is, and it's contagious, right?
Yes.
Like, if you're around somebody who's constantly negative, it's really hard not to get sucked into that vortex.
Totally. So you're saying the Eeyore can be bad for our mental health and our social life.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got the housefly and the Eeyore.
Mm-hmm.
What are the other 2 faces?
Okay, so the third one is the hulking out.
Okay.
So this is the person who, like, their anxiety manifests as anger.
Oh, yeah.
They're yelling, they're punching walls, they're, just like, they have a really hard time controlling their temper.
And that's where those freakout funds come in. That's actually a really good segue. So she talks about these freakout funds that we have, and they're finite, right?
Exactly. And these freakout funds, they're not just about money. Although she does talk about how, freaking out can lead to some poor financial decisions sometimes, but it's really more about our overall resources, right? Like our time, our energy, our, goodwill towards others. Like every time we, have a meltdown, it's like we're spending from these funds. And if we're not careful, we can deplete them very quickly.
I really like that analogy. So if I spend all my freak-out funds on worrying about did I reply all to that email, then when a real crisis hits, I've got nothing left.
Exactly.
It's like having a limited emergency fund for life.
Exactly. And that's such a good way to think about it. And so, yeah, I mean, the hulking out is definitely one way to drain those funds very quickly because, it often leads to, like, saying or doing things that we regret.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Okay, so we've got the housefly, we've got the Eeyore, the hulking out. I'm almost afraid to ask, who is the fourth face of freaking out?
All right. So the fourth one is the ostrich.
Okay.
So this is the person who their go-to coping mechanism is avoidance. They're like, if I just ignore it, it'll go away.
Oh, the classic head in the sand approach.
Exactly. And, sometimes that works for a little bit.
Sure.
But in the long run, it usually just makes things worse, right?
Right.
Because the problem doesn't go away, it just gets bigger.
Right. It's like that credit card bill that you just keep shoving in a drawer. Eventually, it's going to catch up with you. And the longer you wait, the worse it's going to be.
Exactly. So, I think the point of identifying these four faces of freaking out is just to, bring some awareness to how we're reacting to stress and anxiety and to, maybe start to question whether those reactions are actually serving us or not.
Right. So it's about self-awareness and then figuring out which of these faces we might be putting on and if that's actually a healthy and productive way to deal with whatever is going on.
Exactly.
I like it.
Yeah.
So we've got our shitstorm scale to prioritize worries. We're building up our freakout funds by choosing PHW over panic. But how do we actually deal with it when those inevitable challenges arise?
Yeah, that's where Knight really gets into the nitty-gritty and offers some really practical advice.
All right, so let's talk about how to actually deal with it.
Well, she gives us a really useful tool. She calls it identifying your realistic ideal outcome, or RIO.
RIO.
Yeah.
I like it. It's catchy.
It is, right?
But what does it actually mean?
So it's about being, honest with yourself about what you can realistically achieve in a given situation.
Oh.
Like, instead of getting caught up in, fantasies or, best case scenarios,
Right.
you're kind of like, okay, what's a positive outcome that I can actually, work towards?
So less daydreaming about winning the lottery and more like figuring out how to negotiate a raise at work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about, setting realistic expectations and then figuring out the steps to get there.
Okay, so speaking of steps, once you've got your RIO in mind, what's next?
So Knight suggests that you you triage your situation.
Triage, like they do in a hospital.
Exactly.
Okay.
Just like a doctor would prioritize patients based on, the severity of their condition.
Right.
You need to prioritize your worries.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
ones need, immediate attention and which ones can maybe wait a little bit.
So if my kitchen is flooded, I should probably deal with that before I reorganize my sock drawer.
Probably a good idea.
Although I have been meaning to color code them.
There's always time for that.
There is.
Knight actually uses this really great analogy in the book.
Okay.
She talks about her cat, Gladys.
Well, I am always here for a good cat story.
Right. So Gladys, she's a creature of habit.
Okay.
She likes her routine.
Don't they all?
Exactly. But when her routine is disrupted, she doesn't, freak out.
Okay.
She adapts.
What does she do?
Let's say, there's, a sudden influx of noisy humans on the patio.
Right.
Where she normally likes to sunbathe.
Okay.
Does she get all stressed out and, start meowing incessantly? No. She finds a quiet corner, curls up for a nap.
She's like, this is fine.
Exactly. She's like, this is fine. I will adjust.
Okay. I will just
Right.
sweep over here.
Exactly. And the key takeaway here is that, Gladys doesn't waste energy dwelling on the why.
Right.
She's not like, oh, why are these humans here ruining my day? She's more focused on the now what.
That is such a good point. Because we as humans get so stuck on that. Why is this happening to me? Instead of figuring out, okay, but how do I move forward?
Yes, exactly.
Right. So we've identified our RAO. We've triaged the situation. We're channeling our inner Gladys.
I love it.
What's next in our deal with it toolkit?
So this is where Knight, she really shines.
Okay.
Because she dives into these really specific scenarios,
Okay.
from everyday annoyances to major life events.
Right.
And she offers really practical advice on how to deal with each one.
Give me an example.
Okay, so let's say your printer decides to have a complete meltdown.
Of course.
Right when you need to print something really important.
Naturally, it's like a classic.
All right. The timing is always perfect.
Always. When you have 5 minutes to get to this meeting,
Yeah.
and of course, the printer's decided that now's a good time.
Exactly. So what's your deal with it strategy?
Oh, gosh. I don't know, shake my fist at it, maybe threaten to replace it. I don't know if that's actually dealing with it.
Well, Knight would probably tell you to, like, find another printer.
Okay.
Or if you're feeling particularly fed up, she might suggest trying out a tactic that one of her readers shared, which is to rename your printer to Little Fuckbox.
I love that. It's like passive-aggressive therapy for your electronics.
Exactly. Like a little bit of humor, right?
Okay.
Can go a long way in just kind of diffusing that frustration.
Totally.
Sometimes you just got to laugh at the absurdity of it all.
Okay, but what about when the situation's a little bit more serious?
Okay.
Let's say, hypothetically speaking, I may have indulged in one too many spiked eggnogs at the office holiday party
Oh, no.
and said a few things that maybe I now regret.
The dreaded office party faux pas.
Exactly. What's my deal with it strategy there?
Oh, well, Knight actually gives some surprisingly practical advice for this, which is to just embrace the mystery.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
How does that work?
So basically, she argues that dwelling on it is just going to make you feel worse, right?
Right.
Like what's done is done.
Yeah.
So instead, you just pretend like nothing happened.
Okay.
You go about your business as usual.
Nothing to see here.
Exactly. And if anybody brings it up, you just give them a knowing smile.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly. I can't quite recall what happened either.
It's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But for bad karaoke and questionable dance moves,
Exactly.
I like it.
And, Knight points out that this approach can actually save you a lot of those freakout funds,
Right.
right? Because instead of wasting all your energy on guilt and embarrassment,
Yeah.
you can just conserve it.
Conserve it for when you really need it,
Exactly.
like prepping for the next office party.
There you go.
This time I'm sticking to the sparkling cider.
Always a good idea.
But seriously, her approach, it makes you realize how much mental energy we waste on things that we can't change,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's like what's done is done.
Yeah.
You can't go back in time.
Yep.
So you might as well just kind of move forward.
Exactly. And, Knight also doesn't shy away from tougher topics either.
Right.
Like she talks about, things like, debt, relationship issues, even divorce.
Okay, those are some heavy hitters.
Yeah.
How does the deal with it approach apply to those kinds of situations?
Well, it all comes back to those key principles, right?
Yeah.
Identifying your RIO, triaging the situation, focusing on what you can control.
Right.
So, for example, if you're facing a mountain of debt, Knight, she's very clear that, burying your head in the sand is not going to make it disappear.
Right. No more pretending that credit card bill is just a friendly reminder to go shopping.
Exactly. Not the most effective strategy.
Don't talk.
So instead, she encourages you to, take charge.
Okay.
Figure out, what can you realistically afford to pay? Explore options for, maybe consolidating your debt or negotiating lower payments.
Okay.
Create a plan.
So it's about facing the problem head on,
Exactly.
even when it feels overwhelming.
Yes, because the longer you wait, the scarier it gets.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And the same goes for, relationship problems.
Okay.
Knight reminds us that we can't control how other people behave,
Right.
but we can control how we respond.
Okay.
So, if your partner is constantly criticizing you,
Right.
you have a choice, right? You can try to work it out, you can accept it,
Okay.
or you can move on.
So it's about recognizing your own agency.
Yes,
Even in those really challenging situations.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I like that.
So it's not about, being passive.
Right.
It's about, recognizing that you have choices.
You always have a choice.
Exactly.
Okay.
And sometimes the hardest part is just admitting that to ourselves.
That is so true.
Right.
Because it's so easy to feel stuck. Like, well, this is just my life now.
Right. Exactly.
But even with the best deal with it strategies, even when we're being so good about triaging, even when we're channeling Gladys,
right.
there are times when life throws those curveballs and you just get knocked flat.
Of course.
What about those situations where it feels like there's no RIO? There's just no way to triage the pain.
Yeah.
I'm talking about things like grief, loss, trauma,
Right.
those really heavy experiences that make you question everything.
Those are tough ones.
Those are tough ones.
Yeah, and Knight acknowledges that,
Yeah.
she doesn't pretend that there's some, easy solution or a quick fix
Right.
for those kinds of situations.
Because there's not.
No, there's not.
Right.
But she does offer some, really valuable insights into how to navigate them.
Okay.
And, she actually dedicates a significant portion of the book to discussing what she calls the ultimate shitstorm
Sure.
death.
Right. And that's something that I feel like a lot of, especially self-help books kind of dance around.
Yeah.
But it's something we're all going to face eventually.
Every single one of us.
Right. So how does she even approach such a heavy, sensitive subject?
She approaches it with her trademark, like, honesty and compassion and, yes, even a little bit of humor.
You okay?
But I don't want you to mistake her directness for, like, insensitivity.
Right.
She's writing from a place of personal experience,
Of course.
having dealt with the loss of loved ones herself.
Right. Because it's one thing to talk about dealing with difficult emotions in the abstract.
Right.
It's another thing entirely to have lived through them.
Exactly. And I think that really comes through in her writing.
Okay.
You can tell that she's not just like, spouting platitudes.
Right.
She's speaking from a place of like deep understanding.
Right. So how does she suggest we navigate, the ultimate shitstorm?
Well, she starts by acknowledging, the very real pain and grief that come with loss.
Right.
She doesn't try to sugarcoat it
Right.
or pretend that it's not a big deal.
Right. Because it is a big deal.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And it's okay to feel that.
Absolutely.
But she also emphasizes that, even in the face of death, we still have choices. We can choose how we grieve,
Okay.
how we remember, how we move forward.
That's such a powerful message.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to feel powerless
Right.
in the face of that kind of loss.
Absolutely.
But she's reminding us that we still have agency.
Yes.
We still get a say in how this goes, how we navigate our grief journey.
Exactly. Yeah. And she highlights a really important point that I think often gets overlooked in, discussions about grief, which is that sense of injustice.
The why me or it's not fair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That feeling can be so intense,
It can be.
and so hard to process.
Oh, for sure.
But Knight encourages us to, acknowledge it, sit with it, even allow ourselves to feel angry about it.
I think that's so important.
Yeah.
Because so often, and I'm sure you've seen this too, when you're grieving, people are like, oh, well, focus on the positive memories,
Yeah.
celebrate the life that was lived.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, but there's this whole other side
Right.
of anger, of resentment, of feeling like it's just not right.
Yeah.
And that deserves to be acknowledged and processed as well.
Absolutely. And Knight, she doesn't shy away from that.
Right.
She encourages us to feel those feelings fully without judgment.
Right.
Because that's often like the first step in moving through them.
Right. It's about giving yourself permission to grieve authentically,
Yes.
whatever that looks like for you.
It's-
Because there's no right way to do it.
No, there's not. And I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah,
Because, everyone grieves differently.
absolutely.
And what works for one person might not work for another.
Right. So it's about finding what works for you and honoring that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And not judging yourself for it.
Exactly.
Okay. So we're acknowledging the emotional weight
Yes.
of these really difficult experiences.
Yes.
But then there's also often a practical side to dealing with death,
Absolutely.
right? Making funeral arrangements, dealing with legal matters, supporting other grieving family members and friends.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot. And that's where I imagine the shitstorm scale can be really helpful.
Definitely.
And that whole idea of triaging,
Absolutely.
because it's so easy to just feel overwhelmed.
Right, totally.
Because life, in all its messiness, it doesn't stop just because we're grieving.
No, it doesn't.
The bills still need to be paid. The house still needs to be cleaned.
Right. Life goes on.
Yeah. And sometimes those practical tasks,
Yeah.
they can feel even more daunting when you're also dealing with such a profound emotional loss.
Absolutely. And that's where Knight's emphasis on, taking things one step at a time becomes even more crucial, She encourages us to, break down those seemingly insurmountable tasks
Right.
into smaller, more manageable steps.
Okay.
And to ask for help when we need it.
Yeah, because we don't have to do it alone.
We don't have to do it alone.
That is such an important reminder.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to feel like we have to be strong.
Right.
Especially when we're grieving.
Actually then, yeah.
But it's okay to lean on others, to ask for support, to acknowledge that we can't do it all on our own.
Exactly. It doesn't make you weak.
No, it makes you human.
It makes you human, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about calming the heck down, dealing with it, but I feel like her approach is about so much more than just slapping a Band-Aid on our anxieties.
Oh, absolutely.
Like cultivating a whole new way of thinking, a new relationship with our worries.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about recognizing that we have, so much more control than we realize, even in the face of uncertainty and fear.
Right.
It's about shifting our focus from what if to now what.
Yes, and that shift in perspective can be so empowering
It can be huge.
because it allows us to approach those challenges, big or small, with more agency,
Yes.
with more resilience.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like we're not just victims of our circumstances.
Right.
We have the power to choose how we respond.
Exactly. And while we might not be able to avoid every single shitstorm that life throws our way,
Right.
we can learn to weather them with a bit more grace, a bit more humor.
And maybe even a touch of badassery.
And maybe even a touch of badassery. I like that.
I like that too.
Yeah.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
I have.
From the shitstorm scale to the 4 phases of freaking out,
Right.
dealing with printer malfunctions, to navigating the complexities of grief.
It's a lot.
It is. But before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about managing our freakout funds.
Ah, yes. Those precious, precious funds.
Yes, they're precious.
Limited.
They're finite.
Yes.
And we talked about how it's so important to conserve those funds.
Yes.
Not to squander them on worries that are really unlikely to materialize.
Right.
Or things we can't control.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, are there specific strategies that Knight recommends for kind of protecting and replenishing those freakout funds?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that she actually addresses very directly in the book.
Oh, yeah?
So one of the things that she talks about is like, one of the biggest drains on our freakout funds is this constant barrage of negativity that we're exposed to on a daily basis.
Oh, 100%.
Especially, from the news and social media.
It's like we are bombarded with worst-case scenarios 24/7. It's enough to make anyone want to crawl into a bunker with a lifetime supply of chocolate and noise-canceling headphones.
Right. And it's impossible to completely disconnect from the world.
Right.
We need to stay informed.
Right.
We need to be aware of what's happening around us.
Of course, yeah.
But she also encourages us to be mindful of how much negativity we're consuming.
Okay.
And to make a conscious effort to, balance it out.
Right, so it's not about sticking our heads in the sand.
Right.
And pretending that, the world is all sunshine and rainbows.
No, not at all.
But it's about creating a more balanced information diet.
Exactly.
One that nourishes us instead of depleting us.
Yes, I love that, an information diet.
Right.
That's such a good way to think about it.
Because it's true. It's like we're consuming all this.
We're bombarded with it.
Yes.
Constantly.
So how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we counteract that negativity bias?
Yeah.
How do we replenish those depleted freakout funds?
Well, one of the things that Knight suggests is incorporating small acts of joy and self-care into our daily routines.
Okay.
And this doesn't have to be anything elaborate or time-consuming. It could be as simple as taking a walk in nature.
Okay.
Listening to your favorite music.
Right.
Spending time with loved ones. Doing something that makes you feel good.
It's about those little things that bring us joy.
Exactly.
Those moments that remind us that even amidst all the chaos,
Yeah.
there's still beauty and connection and things to be grateful for.
Yes, exactly.
I like that.
And by consciously incorporating those moments into our days, we're not only replenishing our freakout funds,
Right.
but we're also building our resilience.
Yes.
Right? Our ability to cope with whatever life throws our way.
Right. So it's about creating a more balanced, sustainable approach to life.
Yes.
That acknowledges those inevitable challenges.
Right.
But also makes space for joy.
Yes.
For connection.
Yeah.
For self-care.
Absolutely. And that's really the heart of Knight's message.
What do you say?
It's that we have so much more power than we realize to shape our own experiences,
Right.
to navigate those inevitable shitstorms,
Right.
and to cultivate a life that feels both meaningful and fulfilling.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's a message of hope.
It is.
And empowerment.
It is.
Reminding us that even in a world that often feels really chaotic and uncertain, we still have agency.
We do.
We still have a choice.
We do.
And sometimes that choice is as simple as just deciding to calm the heck down.
Sometimes that's all it takes.
It's so easy to get caught up in those moments and forget that we do have that power to choose
We do.
how we respond.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the importance of identifying our RIO, that realistic ideal outcome.
Yeah.
In any given situation.
Right.
But I'm curious, how does that actually play out in real life?
Yeah.
Can you walk me through an example?
Sure. So let's say you're at a restaurant and they bring you the wrong order.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about a small mistake. They got your order completely wrong.
Yeah.
We've all been there, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Ah.
Especially when you've had your eye on that dish all week.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, come on.
Yes.
Recipe for a meltdown.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So in that moment, it's easy to kind of let those emotions take over, right?
Right.
But instead of, kind of going from 0 to 60 in terms of your anger or your frustration night,
Right.
would encourage you to just like pause for a second
Okay.
and think about your RIO. Like, what is the best possible outcome that you can realistically hope for in this situation?
All right, so in a perfect world, the kitchen would magically whip up my original order in record time. No questions asked.
Right.
But realistically,
Yeah.
I'd probably be happy with a sincere apology from the server, having them correct the order promptly,
Right.
and maybe a free dessert for the inconvenience.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. Like, you're not asking for the world here, right? You're
Mm.
just asking for, like, what is fair and reasonable.
Totally.
And by, kind of focusing on that achievable outcome, you're more likely to, like, approach the situation,
Right.
with a sense of, like, calm and assertiveness,
Okay.
which, in turn increases the likelihood that you're actually going to get that positive resolution.
Because you're not coming at it from a place of like anger and frustration already.
Exactly, yeah. Like, nobody wants to help the person who's, like, yelling at them and,
Yeah.
like, throwing a tantrum.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So it's about choosing to engage with the situation instead of letting our emotions dictate our actions,
Yes, exactly.
which can be so hard, but it's so important.
It is hard, and that's why, like, this whole idea of identifying your RIO, it's so helpful, because it gives you that, like, that North Star to kind of, like, focus on, right?
Okay.
Like, when you're feeling yourself getting, carried away,
Right.
you can just kind of like, okay, wait a minute, what am I actually trying to achieve here?
What I'm trying to do. Right. It reminds me of that quote, you can't always control what happens to you, but you can control your reaction. Have you ever heard that?
100 times, and it's so true.
And it's so true. And I feel like that's a lot of what Knight is getting at is that, life is going to throw us curveballs.
It is.
There are going to be things that happen that are outside of our control,
Right.
but we do get to choose how we respond to that.
Absolutely. We always have a choice. Even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment, we always have a choice.
It's about choosing empowerment over overwhelm,
Yes, exactly.
which could be hard. I feel like we said the word hard a lot in this episode, but
Well, life is hard sometimes.
it is. It is. But we don't have to go through it alone. But I do want to say, speaking of not being alone, I love how Knight approaches these like really heavy topics with this sense of humor.
Oh my gosh.
Like
Yeah.
it's almost like she's giving us permission to laugh at the absurdity of it all.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's so important because, when we take ourselves too seriously, we make everything so much harder than it needs to be.
Right. Totally. And so as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into Calm the Fuck Down today, I think if there's like one key takeaway, one thing I want everyone listening to remember is that we have more agency than we realize.
We do.
We have the power to choose how we respond to our anxieties,
Mm.
to navigate those inevitable challenges, and to really like create a more balanced life.
Yes, 100%. And, for anyone listening who's struggling, just remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are resources available, there are people who care, and there's always hope.
Beautifully said. I think that is the perfect place to end it. So, to our listeners, remember to be kind to yourselves and to each other. We'll see you next time.